Welcome back to Ether Hour, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dimitri Kalyagan, coming at you today with a fantastic guest, somebody that we have hoped to have on the show for a while now, the author of the fantastic book Antichrist, The Fulfillment of Globalization, Dr. G.M. Davis. We are joined by him today. He is the author of this fantastic book that both Dimitri and I have read in preparation for this interview. Obviously, by the title, I'm sure you can infer where we're going to go with this subject. So we're very excited to dive into this. Greg, how are you doing? And if you would mind telling the people a little bit about yourself, that would be fantastic. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the introduction. Well, I can tell you that I'm an Orthodox Christian, have been since 2003. I reside now on the East Coast of the United States, though I entered the church in Los Angeles at a small mission there. And this book has been in my mind for many years, really since my dissertation, which I also completed in 2003 at Stanford in political science. Had I been an Orthodox Christian then, as opposed to just sort of sniffing around the church in those years, I might have tried to write this book as my dissertation if the powers that be in academia would have permitted it. I don't know. But it's where my thinking was headed, trying to understand globalization, which I think is the overwhelming political phenomenon in our time.
Interesting, yeah, because I do notice that the theme of globalization, the theme of the Antichrist being a global phenomenon, a king of an earthly prince for the whole world, the sort of progeny, spiritually speaking, of the devil being possessed by Satan and ruling over everybody through the tribe of Dan, progeny, and through that sort of inheritance from Jerusalem, which is the center of the world. It really does paint this global picture, and globalization as a phenomenon, as you probably, as most of our listeners probably well and truly know by now, is a thing which really became obvious and came about, despite the fact that it probably begun a lot earlier, maybe even during the colonial imperialist period. But it really became obvious to us in these, like I would say, 2000s period, possibly even after the presidency of George W. Bush. I would say maybe you'd agree, Greg, that especially during the Obama period, suddenly things became very apparent that, look, the world is actually a lot more united, and definitely institutions such as the United Nations do paint this new world order type of picture around the world where everybody has to follow certain regulations, although albeit the actual prince of the world is not yet here, as in the Antichrist does not come forth personally speaking. But it's very interesting. You wrote this work. It's a great compilation, I would say, of all the other previous great works preceding it, but it also very succinctly, I would say, and briefly, for any viewers and listeners who haven't actually read the book yet, I would say it's a must read if you're interested in eschatology from an Orthodox Christian perspective. In the Orthodox Christian faith, eschatology is quite a big subject. One of the holy books of Scripture, the Book of Revelation by Saint John the Evangelist, written on the island of Patmos in the first century after Christ. It is revelation of things to come. It's quite a short book, but it's very mysterious, and the book itself really doesn't. It's very difficult to interpret and provide commentary on, which I'm sure Greg has realized, because as well during his book itself, he has to cite actual plenty of saints and academics in the Orthodox Church who have actually attempted to comment and interpret some of the visions that Saint John was given. And of course, it's eschatological because it speaks about the end of the world and quite, I would say, scary and revelatory times that will come in our future, which essentially we speak about on the show all the time. It's just Greg's book, the 300 plus pages that he's put work into, actually succinctly summarize basically the views that we hold on the show quite strongly to, I would say, is that, things have really escalated after, in the 20th century, especially after 1917, and this is where we see most things going. But Greg, I just wanted to ask just a quick question, because as soon as you open the book, one thing I think most attentive folks will find is that you elucidate a dedication at the beginning to Tsar Paul I from the Romanov dynasty. This is the Russian emperor who ruled for a brief 3.5 year period, very, very short time at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. and he's essentially is the progenitor of the sort of revitalized Romanov dynastic line. And just wanted to ask you why you found him so fascinating and sort of what inspired you to dedicate the book to this particular Tsar, who, mind you, I think we all agree on the show that I think Tsar Paul will be canonized in the Orthodox Church, and he's already, I would say, glorified by God, but it's just a matter of time before the church and the people here on earth begin venerating him more broadly. But when did you realize, Greg, that Tsar Paul was not just any regular ruler, but also a sort of a real Christian Orthodox example for rulership and maybe even like an anti-Antichrist in a way, like the real cataconic sort of figure of a righteous Christian ruler? And what gave you that fascination to include him in this book, despite the fact that this book really doesn't speak about Tsar Paul, but it does speak about the fact that, it is dedicated to him. So if you could just give us some insight on that.
I think the short answer as to why I dedicated the book to Tsar Paul is that I wanted his help. I mean, I regard him as a passion bearer, at least, in the constellation of Orthodox saints. He was, of course, assassinated, and taking him out, those who murdered him had, I believe, in a sense, eschatological reasons for doing that. They wanted to bring about a new world order that was cleansed of Christian monarchy. And that's why he was really sacrificed at the end of the 18th century.
Hmm.
And that's also why, of course, the Romanov family in the early 20th century in 1918 were murdered because they represented the old order, the old Christian monarchical order. And as you use that word catacon, the force which prevents or stops the revolutionary process, which has been underway for centuries and which I talk about at length in the book. So Tsar Paul had a key role to play, as did the Romanov imperial family that came after him. And really, I wanted his intercessions for the book. That I went in writing the book, I'm faithful to the Orthodox Christian worldview which he represented and died for.
It's a fantastic answer, and everybody should definitely check out Dimitri's article and our episode on Tsar Paul to explore more the topic of his sainthood and the fact that he was not actually a Freemason or any of these things that he is perhaps so commonly accused of, and that he was a fantastic czar despite his short reign. So I think I know when I opened the book and I saw that it was dedicated to him, I knew that I was in for a good read, just right from there. So I think if that's not a good endorsement of the book, it appears that Tsar Paul, may have had a hand himself. So I think everybody, again, the book is linked below, obviously. Buy the book if you haven't already. Be sure to read it. But you mentioned some fantastic ideas that we love to talk about on the show, like the idea of the Catacon and, what that has to do with, the current reemergence of Christian Russia. Of course, we talk about the many prophecies that talk about Russia's, rejuvenation in the Orthodox world. And you mentioned, how the 20th century sort of began in that way with the final destruction of Christian imperium, Christian monarchy on earth with the murder and ritual sacrifice, I believe, was what occurred of the Romanov royal family. And I had the chance in Russia to speak with some very prominent monarchists who believe the same thing about what occurred to the royal family. So this idea is very popular in Russia, and not very popular. I mean, it's considered true by a large portion of the population. And so I'm wondering, sort of in a broader sense, of course, you discuss in the book how, for example, when the Romanov czars and the Russian people defeated Napoleon and, in the Napoleonic Wars and whatnot, how Napoleon, was declared a type of Antichrist by the Russian Orthodox Church. I'm wondering, in the future we hear about prophecies of perhaps a future czar. I'm wondering your thoughts on, how, we see the rise of Antichrist, but we also in theory hear about the rise of a sort of anti-Antichrist who will be a restrainer and who will be perhaps even have a place where certain Christians can go to be protected from the horrors of the reign of Antichrist. So I'm wondering, how will those two things perhaps, I mean, how do those things that sound very, what if one of the people, what if you think you're falling for the Catacon, for example, but it is actually the Antichrist? I'm wondering, these are ideas that I think a lot of people think about. I'm wondering your thoughts on that idea and how the theme of Antichrist, which you talk about in the book, having been played out since Nero, and we see in figures as recent as, Napoleon, Stalin, Hitler, Winston Churchill, even, and others, perhaps. Of course, FDR, you can assign them to any of these political figures. We've even talked about similarities that Donald Trump has with certain Antichrist figures, especially as the situation in Gaza unfolds. So I'm wondering your thoughts as both Christian empire and Christian governance apparently returns, perhaps in a place like Russia, in tandem with, the rise of Antichrist, with what we're seeing, in perhaps Jerusalem today. Since you've written this book, have you noticed anything kind of shifting in those directions?
Well, to me, it seems difficult in our time to be a political figure, an effective political figure, without being an antichrist,
Mm,
because the world is so anti-Christian, because there is so much fraudulent Christianity, and because the exception being, let us say, Russia, perhaps, where we have a secular leader, but who is not trying to be a messianic figure. To me, it seems in the West, it's almost impossible to be an effective leader. And effective, I don't mean effective in the sense of doing good. I mean being politically relevant without the attributes of an antichrist. You mentioned Donald Trump. I think you could also mention Joe Biden. I think you could mention any number of political figures in the West who are little antichrists because they almost inadvertently assume the attributes of a Messiah figure, even if they're not trying to. It's simply the structure of political reality today. The again, the we looking what's going on in Gaza and the West Bank and so on. I don't know that there's anything there that's particularly striking, except that all of the politics there are anti-Christian in an important sense. There's very little Orthodox Christianity that's effectively represented. Excuse me. There's Islam, of course. There's Judaism. There are secular leaders, again, who stand in the place of a Christian representative, but there's very little that's Orthodox there or elsewhere. And certainly in the West, there's very little that's Orthodox. Russia is, to me, the outstanding example of a civilization that is still meaningfully Orthodox. There's not an Orthodox monarch. There's no one who's anointed to rule that society, but effectively, it is still an Orthodox civilization. And of course, there are prophecies that the monarchy will one day return to Russia. And that, of course, is something we can't really foresee. Perhaps that will happen, perhaps it won't. But President Putin has demonstrated himself an effective hedge, I would say, a catacon, if you will, in keeping Western values, secular values, from overwhelming Russia. And he's effectively serving as an Orthodox political representative, even if he's not anointed, even if he's not crowned.
I think that's a very good answer. I think we've extrapolated a somewhat similar idea, even in the midst of certain criticisms we may have of Putin and perhaps some things that, we from a very Orthodox perspective think he could do better. There's just no denying that, he does stand athwart a very obvious, civilizational onslaught that Russia, again, having just visited twice in the past few months, I can say that Russia has very much, in some fairly tangible ways, resisted. It's not to say that it's perfect. It's not to say that there aren't, especially in the cities, cosmopolitan influence and whatnot, and people that, behave that way or the other. But the orthodoxy is deep, and there's no way to not notice it. It's the most prominent social and political religious phenomenon that you really notice while you're there is the sheer presence of orthodoxy. So it's very true. And this episode isn't all going to be about applying things to geopolitics or getting Greg's take on the current situation, but I've just found it so interesting that, again, you in your interview after you published the book, with Orthodox Ethos and Father Peter Hears, you talk about how the Temple Institute and a lot of these groups have amassed specific red heifers. They say, even a pre-built temple ready to be, I guess, kind of delivered onto the Temple Mount once perhaps Al-Aqsa is destroyed. And then, like you said, you talked about Gaza and the West Bank. There's no ignoring the fact that the initial operation from Hamas was Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, ostensibly, at least the pretext being a response to a group of radical Zionist rabbis storming the Al Aqsa Mosque and performing what I believe were rituals meant to presage its destruction and then the rebuilding of the temple on that mountain. So, just in case you have any thoughts on that, I would love to get your perspective on that shift and how it ties into this, this sort of Antichrist. Because on the one hand, this is very obviously tied in with the Antichrist thread, as it literally has to do with Jerusalem and the Third Temple and the Jewish Messiah. And we all know how that contradicts with the Christian Messiah, Christ, who has already come and, will come again in the clouds and not be some kind of earthly political ruler. While at the same time, I think you'd be hard pressed to say that Netanyahu is anything more than just a little typological antichrist. He really isn't that popular around the world or in Israel. He's just happens to have been in power and gotten in this specific context with this threat and this conflict between Zionists and Islam in the region. And so I'm wondering, obviously, there doesn't seem to be any kind of specific Jewish member of the tribe of Dan, as they say, who is emerging as an antichrist. But at the same time, we see this sort of dramatic escalation, for lack of a better term, in the realm of the rebuilding of the third temple. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the current situation.
Well, I would observe that the Antichrist himself, capital A Antichrist, in an important sense, we will not see emerge. He'll emerge at some point, of course, but we're not going to see him climb the political ladder in the
Mm,
sense of a typical politician. His advent will be sudden. At least this is my reading of the Fathers and of the book of Revelation, that he will appear at about 30 years of age, and he will he will eventually become crowned as the King of the Jews in Jerusalem. But it's not like we're going to see a typical political ascent. Antichrist will come suddenly. And you mentioned the temple itself. The temple will, of course, be rebuilt for him. And yes, I think there is a lot of evidence to suggest that Jewish influence in the world is preparing the Temple
mhm.
Institute, that sort of thing, that it is probably already constructed somewhere. It just has to be shipped over and assembled, which could occur very rapidly. But we have to be careful not to speculate too much, lest we get deceived and we wind up, oh, that's the Antichrist there. Oh, no, it's not. And now I'm disappointed and confused and has been led astray. We're talking about eschatological events, which means that these are all ultimately in the hands of God. And we need to be wary and alert, but not frightened and not frenetic in our speculations. So the events in Gaza and the West Bank don't particularly concern me. I mean, apart from the humanitarian angle,
Mhm.
which is very significant. But needless to say, there's been fighting in that part of the world for generations, and there probably will be for generations until Antichrist finally comes and brings an ersatz peace. But the events we're seeing now, I don't think really merit speculation of that kind. I mean, Antichrist could pop up tomorrow, or he might not. He might not for many years. And so we need to be sober in our understanding.
No, I think it's good that you mentioned the word sobriety because that's one thing the book does bring. It's this passionless sort of really orthodox Christian view of exactly the events that will take place when you see a lot of, shall we say, false denominations of Christianity really bring passion into the particular subject. But in the Orthodox Church, it's not like we need to invent, for example, stories about what will take place. We already have a lot of material to deal with, and it's just about actually providing commentary on it, maybe even compiling it into a work such as this, which I think you've done magnificently. And those of you who haven't obtained the book, definitely visit Uncut Mountain Press. Again, it shouldn't be exaggerated. This is definitely a book you should have on your shelf, even if it, you do read it in segments, chapter by chapter, but breaking down the history of the world and where things are going from an Orthodox perspective. And I think one of the sort of chapters that really speaks volumes about exactly where we're going is the chapter about Russia and I suppose its role in the future. We speak about Palestine and the Levant quite a bit on the show, but we also mention Russia, Ukraine, these modern conflicts and where they may be going. And I think it's worth mentioning that there are a few other prophecies from saints in the actual book itself. One of the prophecies, in fact, is probably this is one of my sort of favorite prophecies. I read this perhaps more than a decade ago at this point, but it does actually speak to the fact that the future isn't all too bleak and it's not really a time for despairing because when people do think about the Antichrist, they think about the end times, all the calamities that will follow, and there is a lot of, say, even mental depression associated with that sort of thinking, right? Apocalyptic thinking. But in fact, for us Orthodox Christians, we need to not focus on the negativity of the events to come, but more so on the second coming of Christ, first and foremost, but also on this potential, rebirth that Orthodox Christianity may see after almost a century of being downtrodden by these servants of the Antichrist, who, again, you mentioned are paving the way for their master and for this sort of false incarnation of the Messiah. And one of those saints who prophesies very clearly to us, and this, of course, this prophecy is not disputed because, again, it's you cite our Archbishop Averki Tauschev of Jordanville, New York, one of the leading ROCOR archbishops of the 20th century, who, again, just magnificent works. He's also, and of course, Father Seraphim Rose, they speak about this prophecy. And I've heard this prophecy from Orthodox Christians from France, because, again, Archbishop Theophan of Poltava, who I'm going to cite shortly, he did pass away in a small French commune just west of Paris, despite the fact that he originated in the Russian Empire. So he lived in the Russian Empire. He was the personal confessor for a time of Saint Nicholas II and the royal family, so the Tsar himself. And he had the dealings with all the revolutionary actions which took place. He was a staunch conservative, a staunch monarchist, and once the revolution took place, he emigrated and essentially didn't. It wasn't an emigration. It was he took refuge in France. He was a refugee. First moved to Bulgaria, stayed for a time in Serbia, but then moved to France and became a recluse. And this is one of the prophecies which he passes on to us, both in writing as well as verbally. So I'll just quickly read this prophecy out. This is included in Greg Davis's book. You ask me about the near future and about the last times. I do not speak on my own, but give the revelation of the elders. The coming of Antichrist draws nigh and is very near. The time separating us from him should be counted a matter of years, and at most a matter of some decades. But before the coming of the Antichrist, Russia must yet be restored, to be sure for a short time. And in Russia there must be a Tsar, forechosen by the Lord himself. He will be a man of burning faith, great mind, and iron will. This much has been revealed about him. We shall wait until the fulfillment of what has been revealed. Judging by many signs, it is drawing nigh, unless, because of our sins, the Lord God shall revoke, shall alter what has been promised. According to the witness of the word of God, this also happens. So, very short prophecy, but it does speak about the coming of an Orthodox monarch, possibly before or just before the sort of enthroning of the Antichrist, his sudden appearance, which you speak about. But this prophecy, I think, it does kind of shed some light on the situation in terms of, well, it's not just the downhill sort of segment of world history, which you do cover quite in depth, Mr. Davis. But I do want to mention, like, Archbishop Theophan, these sort of prophecies about the rebirth of orthodoxy. Of course, we need to view them extremely carefully. But do you believe this is probably why we see all these geopolitical events focused on subduing and corrupting Orthodox countries first and foremost? Because again, our enemies also know of these prophecies and these sort of sayings about the future, and they fear another 19th century, beginning of the reign of Tsar Paul. They fear of another, say, reign of the Komnenos emperors in the Byzantine Empire. They fear another period of Christian stability in world affairs, wherein there would be simply no chance for an Antichrist to be brought forward by, the secret cabal which, rules sort of these, events behind the scenes. And I think they also fear the possibility. So this is why they allow us, to have certain, leeways. They give us patriarchs, they give us synods, they even give us these bizarre false councils, such as the one that took place on Crete. They allow us some freedom, but what they won't, of course, allow Orthodox Christians to, have is, of course, that sort of religio-political independence, which we at one point did hold, I would say. And that's the curious thing about the 21st century, is we almost have, the Orthodox Church is almost there, but we are still sort of missing this one particular element which we've had for the last, I would say, 17 centuries. Do you think there's something to it? This geopolitical tension that Orthodox Christian countries are facing: Greece, Russia, Georgia, Bulgaria, Romania, etc., and of course Serbia. Less shall we not mention them. But do you think there's anything there for our listeners from a personal perspective, and maybe even the people you spoke to throughout your Orthodox Christian life?
Yes, no, I think so. I mean, Russia in particular is a target because she is still an Orthodox country. I mean, when one looks at other countries like Romania, Serbia, Greece, they have been, for lack of a better term, persecuted by the West. Russia was, in a sense, persecuted by the West in the 1990s, pulled apart and plundered to a great degree. But the idea of an Orthodox nation state is the terror of Western-based globalization. That's the last thing they want, because it is a way of forestalling the one world order, for lack of a better term, that the West is still busily constructing. So I think the answer to your question is basically yes. Whether we will see an Orthodox monarch, an anointed emperor in Moscow, is, I think, anybody's guess. But the fact remains that Russia is an independent Orthodox nation state, and that is why she is so much the target of Western-backed policies that are really intended to pull Russia to pieces and dismember the country.
Mm.
And I think President Putin, whatever his faults, appreciates this. He sees it, even if he doesn't say it. And so he is determined not to let that happen on his watch. And I don't think it will happen on his watch. After him is, I think, anybody's guess.
I agree. That really is the question, is the successor to Putin going to maintain or perhaps even increase, the resistance, as we could call it, to the spirit of Antichrist, the spirit of the age? And that's we're, I guess, going to live to see that, as Putin is older than everybody on this call. So we will live to see, I guess, the fallout of that future. And before we, while we're still public, before we get behind the paywall, I would be remiss not to mention the fact that the epilogue of this fantastic book was written by our great mutual friend of the show, in our opinion, a true and tried member of the World War Now extended universe, Jim Jatras. And he spends a lot of time focusing on the pandemic that this book was sort of written in the midst of, that is still, again, we still see, our society is the way it is today. And it's a post-COVID world, much like there was a pre 9/11 and a post 9/11 world. We're in the post-COVID world, and there are things that are the way they are because of that, that are just part of life. We don't even really think about them anymore. And from an Orthodox perspective, of course, we've talked about it on the show. I think to say that St. Paisios's prophecies weren't, at least in some regard, warning about that very issue that occurred in the early 2020s is foolish. I think the fact that he said that and it occurred within the lifetime of many who heard it, and his spiritual children reacted to the issues with the pandemic the way they did, it shows that when he spoke about, the vaccine, the inoculation, and how it would be dangerous and how it would, again, there's discussions that it'd be a precursor to the mark and everything like this. This is something that is discussed in the book and is something that, people are forgetting about now with all the geopolitical craziness, perhaps in Russia and Ukraine and the Holy Land. But it's something that, let's say there's a disease that comes around that does kill a lot more people than COVID, they will have much more of a pretext to immediately re-implement this sort of system. So again, when you get the book and read it, be sure to read to the end and be sure to read the epilogue by our good friend Jim Jatras. But again, before we, get into some even more, interesting topics, I want to get your thoughts on the current state, I guess, of the worldwide health regime, and perhaps both what St. Paisios discussed about it and how we're going to see that perhaps come back in the future.
Well, I think there was a great leap forward, for the WHO during COVID. And as you say, the road seems paved for another clampdown should there be a contagious disease or the threat of a contagious disease worldwide, that the WHO or other institutions would use as leverage to mark or inoculate huge numbers of the world's population. That seems, I don't want to say inevitable, because I don't believe that, but it seems like that could be a likely scenario. And we need to bear in mind that the motto of the Antichrist, or of anti-Christian politics in general, is peace and safety. That in order to get peace and safety, we have to hand over our freedoms, our liberties. And of course, the most important liberty we have is spiritual liberty. But that spiritual liberty is contained, of course, in a physical body and is connected. We mustn't commit the error of Gnosticism to think that we can separate out indefinitely our spiritual liberty from our physical liberty. But whether there's another pandemic, my own speculation is that we'll see something else first. We've had a pandemic which caught a lot of people off guard. We may have another, of course, but I expect that the powers that be will try something different first. That's my own personal historical observation, that, again, history doesn't really repeat, but it does rhyme. And there will be some crisis that will justify the taking away of liberties, but I don't think it will be, at least this next time around, a pandemic the way COVID was.
No, I think that makes complete sense. And, in light of the events which are sort of prophesized to come, it's mentioned in your book, of course, you speak about the mark of the beast, which, of course, a lot of people, I would say this probably has the most speculation about, because it's perhaps one of the elements of Christian eschatology which is somewhat prescriptive. And the prescriptive element of it is, well, for us Orthodox Christians, and even all Christians, it would be to be loyal to Christ, to be faithful, and to not accept a mark. So this sort of to do, kind of what you should not do, this prescriptive nature of the particular mark is on a lot of people's minds, hence its relevance to perhaps events such as the COVID pandemic, which took place, the sort of mental preparations which the powers of the world have tried to push onto us. And I just wanted your thoughts, Greg, about the mark of the beast, because you do, and maybe you could, spoiler alert, guys, for those who haven't read the book, you could mention some of the elements of the mark which you mentioned in the book yourself, and you speak about this alchemical mixture of technology as well as magic. And when we speak about magic, we're not talking about Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. When we're actually speaking about the real life demonic influence, which of course produces mages and sorcerers, warlocks, and all kinds of witches throughout history, who we've seen in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, and we see thoroughly through the lives of saints, and quite aptly we actually view today. I think a lot of the time not even realizing it. Right, this is a real negative element in our lives, but magic and sorcery, you mentioned how it interacts with technology and how this could bring about this particular mark of the beast, which the Antichrist and the false prophet will, through which they will sort of obtain dominance over all people of the earth. And also, what are your thoughts about this particular mark, and how do you think? Because this is probably one of the more spoken about elements of the book of Revelation of Saint John the Evangelist, and I guess it would be interesting to hear your particular take as somebody who's, more researched than 99.9% of Orthodox Christians on the subject of Christian eschatology, which you have the, I guess, the fortune and the hard, you've put in the hard work, so you're quite aware of these elements. So as an Orthodox Christian who's actually put in the work, what would be your what would be your professional opinion? And you can go into speculation or mention the elements you brought up in the book itself.
Well, yeah, it has to be speculation to some degree, but certainly the technological advances we've seen that would allow for a physical mark on the human body, which would allow for commerce transactions like a barcode, like I think it's a CFP or CFD, a chip that would be implanted in the body, a physical chip that would include one's bank account or credit card information, and that could be scanned in a store or a place of commerce. I mean, that kind of technology already exists, even if it's not being used. And if we think of the time in which the book of Revelation was written, back in the first century AD, the idea of something that would allow for transactions implanted in the body itself, the human body, would seem bizarre and implausible. But now in our time, it's entirely plausible. And the fathers are clear, I think, that getting the mark is something that, of course, we as Orthodox Christians must resist, even if everybody's doing it, and even if it becomes apparently necessary for commerce, for buying and selling. I mean, I don't know if St. John foresaw a mark on the skin on the right hand or on the forehead that would actually allow for the mechanism of buying and selling. It's hard to imagine that in the first century, but apparently that's what he foresaw. And we now in the 21st century have the technology to make it a reality, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think to ignore some of the obvious implications of this technology and the fact that, like you said, it exists, it's just about its implementation, and not to realize that it would be, it's perhaps integrating an even more totalizing economic control system than even St. John would have been capable of understanding at the time, when perhaps you just think, oh, there'll be a tattoo, and then all of the empire's men or the king's men will just enforce it based on that. But no, this is digitized. It's an extreme. It's a computerized system that can, in theory, do this perfectly without almost any human error, which is, again, to not start to think about the eschatological implications of certain technologies like that, I think is to sort of fall for the spirit of the age. So even though again we are in the realm of speculation, I think it's important to be prudent and be wise as serpents, as the scriptures say. But I'm going to read a passage here from Elder Athanasios Mytileneos, who reposed in 2006. He was a Greek elder. He was an abbot of a monastery outside of Thessaloniki and is considered a great speaker on the Word of God. And he exposited Revelation and is very much shares very similar thoughts with Greg and his story in his book, and is very much not doesn't dabble in the realm of vast speculation and predictions and dates and things like this. However, he makes a point to state what is his own opinion here, and I wanted to read it and get Dr. Davis's thoughts on the sort of this level of symbolic interpretation and kind of the way the Holy Spirit will perhaps enlighten those who are willing to listen about the Antichrist in the time when that is to come. So this starts in book one of his Revelation series. Elder Athanasio says, "An ecclesiastical development has impressed me a great deal. I do not know if this feeling of mine is completely accurate, but I will share it with you. Until the 15th century, the faithful that shed their blood for the faith were simply called saints or martyrs. Since the 15th century, the martyrs are called new or neo-martyrs. Historically, we have some significant events that divide sections of history. More specifically, after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, close to 1500, we see the rise of this new phenomenon. This new terminology that labels the martyrs after the fall of Constantinople as neo-martyrs. Those that finished their lives peacefully since the date also bear the new term. So we have Saint Nectarios, the newly manifested, Saint Nicodemus, the new, or Saint Constantine, the new. Naming a saint a new martyr or newly revealed gives the feeling of a chronological boundary. In other words, let's say that we have the arrival of a new historical time, maybe 500 years from now. How is the church supposed to classify the martyrs and saints that will appear 500 years from now? The new martyrs or the super new martyrs? It does not make sense. Do you know what this means? When the church talks about new, it means that we have the old and now the new. And after the new, there will be no newer ones. I am afraid that in the universal conscience of the church, there is a smoldering feeling that the end is near. This is why the church uses the term new for her saints. And of course, this is in the midst of, hundreds of pages of Elder Athanasios implying, the both the imminence and the transcendence of the book of Revelation and the prophecy, and how it was speaking so much to the people of the time who would, of course, witness the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, but at the same time, how we today need to always be on the lookout for the spirit of Antichrist. Yet, even in the midst of his sober reading of the text, he still feels so compelled by the Holy Spirit and what he perceives as the tradition of the church to say that perhaps there is evidence that we are perhaps in a time more ripe for Antichrist than before. So, Greg, I'd love your thoughts. And perhaps if you hadn't read Elder Athanasios, or if you had, I'd love your thoughts on any of his ideas.
Well, I have read Elder Athanasius Mytileneos, and he is, one of the great authorities on the Book of Revelation, without question. And I think he makes an excellent point.
Thank you so much for listening to the free segment of Ether Hour. It was a pretty long one this time, right? So you can't say we're being stingy on you, but be sure to get behind the paywall to hear the rest of this discussion. We get into some fantastic topics like the tribe of Dan, some specific political realities that we're facing today, and of course some other prophecies, and Dr. Davis's thoughts on all of that. So be sure to get the book as well as get behind the paywall to hear this fantastic episode in full. So thank you so much for listening, and God bless. We'll see you on the other side.